The chamber of the Galactic Council stretched across nearly a kilometer of polished crystal flooring, and the delegates from 300 species sat in their designated sections according to ancient protocol that had maintained peace for over 2,000 cycles. Ambassador Sarah Chun of Earth stood in the petitioner's circle waiting for her turn to speak, and she watched as the Vraxian representative finished his statement about the unfortunate incident at Proxima Station. The word unfortunate made her jaw tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. The Vraxian delegate was tall and covered in iridescent scales that shifted colors as he spoke, and his voice carried the arrogant tone of someone who believed the matter was already settled. The human outpost was constructed in disputed territory. The Vraxian continued, and his triple-jointed arms gestured broadly. Our military response was measured and appropriate under Galactic Law Section 47, Paragraph 12, which clearly states that 3,000 civilians. Chun interrupted, and the chamber fell silent because interrupting was simply not done in council proceedings. The Speaker of the Council leaned forward from his elevated platform, and his ancient face showed surprise. Ambassador Chun, you will wait your turn too. 3,000 human civilians are dead, Chun said again, and her voice was calm but carried across the vast chamber. Not soldiers, but miners and engineers and support staff and their families, including 247 children under the age of 10. Standard cycles, the Vraxian. The delegate made a dismissive gesture. Collateral damage in a legitimate military operation, and we have offered the standard compensation of 50,000 credits per casualty, which is generous considering generous. Chen repeated, and something in her tone made several nearby delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. The speaker raised one hand. Ambassador Chun, the council recognizes that this is your species' first major incident since joining our body 10 cycles ago, and we understand emotions may run high, but we have established protocols for exactly these situations. Chun looked up at the speaker and then slowly turned to scan the entire chamber, and representatives from hundreds of worlds looked back at her with expressions ranging from sympathy to boredom to barely concealed amusement at the new species. Learning how galactic politics actually worked. Protocols. She said quietly, "Yes, I have studied your protocols extensively, and I see how this usually proceeds." The Tholian delegate who served as mediator for territorial disputes stood up. The council will convene a fact-finding mission, which typically takes 18 to 24 months, and then we will review the evidence and determine appropriate sanctions or reparations, and the Vraxian Confederation has already agreed to participate fully in this process. Several delegates nodded approvingly, and the Vraxian representative even managed to look somewhat contrite. Chen pulled out a data tablet and activated a holographic display above the petitioner's circle. "This is Proxima Station before the attack," she said, and the image showed a modest collection of habitation domes and mining facilities orbiting a rocky planetoid. Note the complete absence of military installations or defensive systems. The hologram shifted, and now it showed the aftermath, and debris floated where the station had been, with only a few twisted pieces of hull plating remaining. The Vraxian fleet fired for 47 minutes after our distress beacon activated. Chum continued. They maintained weapons lock while escape pods launched, and they destroyed 73% of those pods before leaving the system. A murmur ran through the chamber, and even some of the more jaded delegates looked uncomfortable. The Vraxian delegate stood again. "We have explained that our targeting systems malfunctioned, and your targeting systems performed exactly as designed." Chun interrupted, and she displayed technical readouts. "We recovered data from the destroyed pods and your ships, adjusted firing solutions to track moving targets, which requires active sensor locks, not malfunctions." The speaker looked troubled. "Now, Ambassador Chen, these are serious accusations, and they will be thoroughly investigated through proper channels, but making inflammatory statements in open council I am not making accusations, Chun said, and she deactivated the hologram. I am stating facts, and now I will state Earth's position on this matter. The entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. Humanity demands the following, Chun said, and her voice remained calm and measured. First, complete Vraxian withdrawal from the Proxima system and the two adjacent systems of Kepler 442 and Ross 128 within 30 standard days. The Vraxian delegate laughed. Absolutely not, and those systems have been second. Chun continued, as if he had not spoken, immediate surrender of Admiral Vex Kohler and all ship commanders who participated in the attack to face trial under human jurisdiction. Now multiple delegates were talking at once, and the speaker had to activate the chamber's acoustic dampeners. This is outrageous, the Vraxian shouted. The Council does not permit member species to demand extradition of third, Chun said, and now her voice cut through the noise like a blade. Transfer of 15 billion credits to a fund for the families of the victims. The Tholian mediator stood. Ambassador Chun, while we sympathize with your loss, these demands are completely outside the bounds of established Council practice, and no first contact species has ever been permitted to. We are not asking for permission, Chun said quietly. The chamber fell absolutely silent again. The speaker leaned back in his seat and studied the human ambassador with new attention. Ambassador Chun, I strongly urge you to reconsider this approach because the Galactic Council has maintained peace for millennia through careful diplomacy and measured responses, and if every species responded to incidents with such extreme demands, then perhaps there would be fewer incidents. Chun said. She tapped her data tablet one more time, and a transmission code appeared above the petitioner's circle. That is the secure channel to Earth's diplomatic corps, she said. You have 72 hours to communicate your acceptance of our terms. The Vraxian delegate was nearly vibrating with rage. And if we refuse, which we absolutely do, then what will you do exactly? And your entire species has perhaps 100 documented warships against our fleet of over 300 capital ships, and you are in no position to make threats. Chun looked at him for a long moment, and several delegates later reported that something in her eyes made them feel suddenly cold despite the chamber's climate controls. We gave you our terms, she said simply. You have 72 hours. She turned and walked out of the chamber, and the sound of her footsteps echoed in the absolute silence she left behind. After she was gone, the Vraxian delegate began laughing. The arrogance of these newcomers is astounding, and they actually believe we will surrender systems and commanders because they made demands. The speaker said nothing, but he was reviewing Earth's admission files with growing unease, and there were gaps in the information and things that humanity had been strangely reluctant to discuss about their military capabilities and their history before achieving faster than light travel. The Tholian mediator approached the speaker's platform. Should we be concerned? He asked quietly. The speaker watched the door through which Ambassador Chun had departed. I am not certain, he admitted, but something about that human certainty troubles me deeply. In the Vraxian section, Admiral Vex Kohler himself sat among the delegates, and he smiled at the thought of these upstart humans trying to threaten the might of the Confederation. He had exactly 60 hours before he would understand the catastrophic nature of his mistake. 60 hours after Ambassador Chun walked out of the council chamber, the Vraxian home fleet simply vanished. It happened during third watch, when most of the council monitoring stations operated with skeleton crews, and the first indication that something was wrong came from a Vraxian civilian transport that had been approaching their home system. The transport's captain sent an emergency broadcast that was picked up by 17 different council relay stations simultaneously. Home fleet is gone, the message said, and the captain's voice trembled with confusion. 312 ships were holding formation at the eclipse point, and now sensors show nothing but empty space. Within minutes, the Council's emergency session was convened, and delegates arrived in various states of dress and alertness, and the Vraxian section was in complete chaos, with representatives shouting into communicators and demanding explanations. The speaker activated the main display, and it showed the Vraxian home system with real-time data from automated monitoring satellites. The fleet had indeed vanished, and there was no debris field or residual energy signatures or distress beacons, and 300 warships containing over 50,000 crew members had simply ceased to exist. This is impossible, the Vraxian Prime Minister said, and his scales had turned completely white with stress. Ships do not just disappear, and there must be sensor malfunction or some kind of cloaking technology, but even then, the mass would register. Where is the human ambassador? Someone asked. Everyone turned to look at Earth's section, and it was empty. The speaker's communication officer spoke up. Ambassador Chun requested permission to address the council, and she is waiting in the antechamber. Send her in immediately. The Prime Minister demanded. Chun entered the chamber looking as calm and composed as she had 3 days earlier, and she walked to the petitioner's circle without hurrying, and her expression showed no surprise at the emergency session. Ambassador Chun, the speaker said, do you know anything about the disappearance of the Vraxian fleet? Disappearance? Chun said, and she raised one eyebrow. Oh, they have not disappeared, and the fleet was destroyed approximately 2 hours ago in a military operation conducted by Earth's Expeditionary Response Group. The chamber erupted, and delegates were shouting, and the Vraxian Prime Minister was screaming something about acts of war, and the acoustic dampeners struggled to contain the noise. Chun waited patiently until the speaker restored order. You admit to destroying over 300 warships? The speaker asked, and his voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Do you understand what you have done? And this is an unprecedented act of aggression, and the council cannot allow. We provided terms. Chun interrupted. Those terms were rejected with mockery and laughter, and we explained that there would be consequences. The Tholian mediator stood up. Ambassador, even if we accept your justification, which we do not, you cannot possibly expect U.S. to believe that humanity destroyed the entire Vraxian home fleet, and our intelligence estimates put your total military capacity at perhaps 100 ships, and the Vraxians had 3 times that number plus defensive installations, and Chun tapped her tablet, and a new holographic display appeared above the petitioner's circle. The display showed footage from what appeared to be a military engagement, and the timestamp indicated it was from exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes ago. Assembled delegates watched in growing horror as the recording played. 12 ships appeared on screen, and they were unlike any design in the council databases, with hull configurations that seemed to bend light around them, and they moved through space with a grace that made even the most advanced council vessels look clumsy by comparison. 12 ships? The Vraxian Prime Minister said, and his voice mixed disbelief with desperate hope. You sent 12 ships against our entire fleet? We sent the minimum force necessary to complete the objective, Chun said. The holographic display, the human ships began their attack, and what happened next would be analyzed by military strategists across the galaxy for generations to come. The human vessels did not fire missiles or energy beams like conventional warships. Instead, they released what appeared to be small drones, and thousands of them spreading out in precise geometric patterns. The Vraxian fleet detected the drones and began defensive maneuvers, but they were too slow, and the drones moved with impossible speed and agility. Each drone attached itself to a Vraxian ship's hull, and what happened next was both beautiful and terrifying. And the drones activated some kind of directed energy field that caused molecular destabilization, and entire warships began to break apart at the seams as their hull plating separated into component atoms. The Vraxian crews had no time to evacuate, and their ships simply ceased to exist, and 300 vessels reduced to dispersing clouds of atoms in less than 4 minutes. But the recording was not finished. The human ships activated different systems and tractor beams of unprecedented power reached out and began collecting specific debris, and the hologram zoomed in to show the beams targeting and retrieving escape pods and life support modules, and anything that contained living beings. We recovered 1,473 survivors, Chen said quietly, including Admiral Vexkoller and 47 of his sirs. The chamber was absolutely silent now. The survivors are currently in Earth custody, and they will face trial for crimes against humanity. Chen continued. The 48 individuals directly responsible for the attack on Proxima Station will be prosecuted under our laws, and the remaining survivors will be returned to the Vraxian government once legal proceedings are complete. The Vraxian Prime Minister slumped in his seat. You took our entire fleet, he whispered. We neutralized a military threat, Chung corrected. Your merchant fleet remains untouched, and your planetary defenses remain operational, and your civilian population has not been harmed, and we could have done far worse. The speaker found his voice. Ambassador Chun, the Galactic Council cannot and will not tolerate such disproportionate response to disproportionate, Chun said, and now there was steel in her voice. They killed 3,000 of our people, and we destroyed their capacity to do it again, and we took extraordinary measures to preserve life, even among the enemy fleet. And by what calculation is that disproportionate? The Tholian mediator stepped forward. By every standard of council justice, and you cannot simply execute military personnel for following orders in what they believed was a legitimate operation. Chun's tablet chimed, and she looked at it, then back at the assembled council. I have additional information to share, she said. The holographic display changed, and now it showed technical specifications and manufacturing data and deployment schedules. These are the locations of Earth's stealth installations throughout Council space, Chun said calmly. We have maintained monitoring stations in 47 systems for the past 8 standard cycles. Gasps echoed through the chamber. These are the technical specifications for our defensive systems, which are approximately 40 to 60 years ahead of current Council technology in most categories, she continued. And these are the locations and capabilities of our primary fleet assets, which number not 100 ships, but over 800, with 300 more under construction. The display continued cycling through information that shook the foundations of what the Council thought they knew about humanity. We have been here watching and listening and learning since before you accepted us as members, Chun said. We studied your protocols and your politics and your military capabilities, and we chose to be peaceful because peace serves our interests. She deactivated the display and looked directly at the speaker. But do not mistake our preference for peace as inability to wage war, she said. The Vraxian commanders responsible for Proxima Station will face human justice, and the 3 systems we demanded will be transferred to Earth control, and the compensation will be paid. The Prime Minister stood on shaking legs. And if we refuse? Chun's expression did not change. Then we will consider it a declaration that the Vraxian government endorses the murder of human civilians, and we will respond accordingly. The speaker raised both hands. Ambassador Chun, the Council must discuss this situation, and we request that you withdraw while we deliberate. Chun nodded and turned to leave, but paused at the chamber entrance. One more thing, she said. 73 escape pods were destroyed at Proxima Station, and the pod targeting was not a malfunction, and it was a war crime, and humanity will not negotiate on this point. She left, and the chamber remained silent for nearly a full minute after her departure. Finally, the Vraxian Prime Minister spoke. What have we done? Nobody had an answer. The Galactic Council had faced many crises in its 2,000-year history, but none quite like this, and the delegates gathered in emergency session for the third consecutive day, and still no consensus had emerged on how to handle the human situation. The collective minds of Thria held the position of senior council member by virtue of their species, age and technological advancement, and their representative was a Gestalt consciousness that spoke through a crystalline matrix, and their voice resonated through the chamber with harmonic certainty. The principle at stake is clear. The collective said, if we allow humanity's actions to stand unchallenged, then we establish a precedent that any species can respond to. Territorial disputes with overwhelming military force, and our entire system of measured response and diplomatic resolution will collapse. 17 other species had already signed onto the collective's proposal for comprehensive sanctions against Earth, including trade restrictions and suspension of council membership and military containment protocols. The Vraxian section remained notably quiet, and their prime minister had not spoken since the previous day's revelations. The Bitte speaker addressed the assembly. The sanctions proposal has significant support, but before we proceed to a vote, I want to ensure all voices are heard, and are there any who wish to speak against the measure? A delegate from the Deneb Union stood, and she was from a species that rarely participated in council politics, and her people were archivists and historians rather than politicians or warriors. I have been researching Earth's history, she said, and I believe the council is operating under dangerous misconceptions about who and what humanity is. The collective's crystalline form pulsed with colors indicating skepticism. The humans have already demonstrated what they are, and they are a militaristic species that concealed their true capabilities while infiltrating our space, and now they reveal themselves as conquerors. That is not what the historical data shows, the Deneb archivist said, and she activated a display. Earth was observed for 200 standard cycles before first contact, and our survey teams documented their development extensively. The display showed images of Earth at various points in its history, and cities rising and falling, and wars that scarred entire continents, and weapons that could crack open planets. What we observed was a species that nearly destroyed itself 3 separate times. The archivist continued nuclear exchange in their year 2041 that killed 2 billion people, and biological warfare in 2087 that killed another billion, and artificial intelligence conflict in 2134 that devastated their infrastructure. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably, and they had seen aggressive species before, but few that had survived such self-inflicted catastrophes. After the third near-extinction event, humanity made a collective choice, the archivist said. They restructured their entire civilization around preventing future existential conflicts, and they developed technologies specifically designed to end wars quickly and decisively because they understood that prolonged conflicts inevitably escalate to weapons of mass destruction. The Tholian mediator spoke up. So you are suggesting their military doctrine is based on trauma rather than aggression? I am suggesting their military doctrine is based on hard experience, the archivist replied. I access classified files from Earth's admission process, and their military command structure operates under very specific rules of engagement. She displayed a document that had been translated from human standard language. Overwhelming response to existential threats. She read, proportionate response to rational actors, and zero tolerance for attacks on civilians. The collective pulsed with dismissive colors. How is destroying an entire fleet a proportionate response? Because they did not destroy the Vraxian civilization, the archivist said quietly. They destroyed the military capacity to repeat the attack, and they took extraordinary measures to preserve life even among enemy combatants, and by their own doctrine, they showed restraint. Restraint. The Vraxian Prime Minister finally spoke, and his voice was bitter. They annihilated our fleet in 4 minutes. The archivist turned to face him. Yes, and they could have done the same to every Raxian colony and industrial station and population center, but they did not, and they removed a specific military threat and extracted specific individuals for justice and nothing more. She brought up another display showing comparative analysis. According to the data, humanity possessed the technical capability to sterilize all 7 Raxian homeworlds. She said, their weapon systems include planet-scale destructive capabilities that they have not used in over 90 years, and they could have ended the Vrachian species entirely, but they chose the most precise response possible. The chamber was very quiet now. The question before us, the archivist continued, is not whether humanity's response was disproportionate by our standards, but whether our standards are adequate for a galaxy that contained species like the Vraxians, who believed killing human civilians would be consequence-free. The collective's crystalline matrix went dark for several seconds, which indicated deep processing. Are you suggesting we have been naive? I am suggesting we have been fortunate. The archivist said, the Council's diplomatic methods work because most species evolved in environments that favored cooperation and consensus, and humanity evolved on a death world where the primary threat to human survival was other humans. She displayed images of Earth and a planet with extreme climate variations, an aggressive megafauna, and geological instability that would have made most Council species extinct within generations. They learned to be diplomatic because they learned what war truly costs. She said, not from reading about it or philosophizing about it, but from experiencing it directly and repeatedly and barely surviving. The speaker leaned forward. What exactly are you proposing, archivist? I am proposing that we reconsider what happened at Proxima Station from humanity's perspective. She said, the Vraxians attacked civilians in what they believed was a safe target, and they destroyed escape pods, which is a war crime under our own laws, and they expected to face sanctions and negotiations and maybe pay some credits. She paused and looked around the chamber. Humanity expected justice. She continued, when they did not receive it through our systems, they created it through theirs, and that is not aggression. It is something far more dangerous to those who prey on the weak. What is that? Someone asked. Certainty. The archivist said, certainty that there will be consequences, and certainty that those consequences will be swift and severe, and certainty that no amount of political maneuvering will prevent them. The collective pulsed with agitated colors. You are defending their actions? I am explaining their actions. The archivist corrected. There is a difference, and if we sanction humanity, we need to understand what we are really doing, and we are not punishing an aggressor. We are punishing a species that enforced accountability when our systems failed. To do so, the Vraxian Prime Minister stood slowly. The archivist makes valid points, he said, and his scales had shifted to colors indicating shame. My government has reviewed the tactical data from Proxima Station and Admiral Vexcolar's orders explicitly included targeting escape pods, and he believed humanity would accept Council arbitration and financial compensation, and he was wrong. He looked directly at the collective's representative. If we had attacked Tholian civilians and destroyed their escape pods, what would your response have been? The collective was silent for a long moment. We do not engage in military conflicts because you have never needed to. The Prime Minister said, because the threat of council sanctions and diplomatic isolation is sufficient deterrent. But what if it was not, and what if a species attacked you, believing you were too civilized to retaliate effectively? We would seek council protection, the collective said, and if the council moved too slowly or offered insufficient justice. The Prime Minister pressed, would you simply accept the loss of your people? The collective did not answer. The speaker stood, and his ancient face showed deep concern. This debate reveals a fundamental question about the nature of our council and we have built our civilization on the principle that all conflicts can be resolved through dialogue and measured response, and humanity challenges that principle. Perhaps it needed challenging. The Deneb archivist said softly. How many times have council processes been too slow or too lenient, and how many species have exploited our preference for diplomacy, and how many have committed atrocities, knowing the worst they faced was sanctions and fines? The Tholian mediator looked troubled. You are suggesting our system is flawed? I am suggesting our system works for civilized species, and the Raxians proved they were not acting in a civilized manner. The archivist said, humanity simply provided the correction our system could not. The speaker called for a recess, and the delegates needed time to process what they had learned, and the vote on sanctions was postponed indefinitely. In the empty chamber, the Vraxian Prime Minister approached the Deneb archivist. Thank you for speaking, he said quietly. I spoke for truth, not for your benefit. She replied, your species made a terrible mistake. I know, he said. We thought humans were weak because they chose peace. The recess lasted 6 standard days, and during that time, the Deneb archivists continued their research into humanity's history, and what they discovered made them request an emergency closed session of the council's senior leadership. Only 20 representatives attended, and one from each of the oldest and most influential species, and the Deneb archivist stood before them with data files that represented months of continuous research. I need to show you something, she said, and I warn you that what you are about to see will fundamentally change your understanding of Earth and its people. The speaker gestured for her to proceed. The display activated and showed Earth from space during what the timestamp indicated was approximately 300 cycles ago. This is Earth during what humans call the resource wars. The archivist said, watch. The planet's surface erupted with light and nuclear detonations, blossomed across 3 continents and cities that had stood for centuries, vanished in seconds, and the delegates watched in horror as humanity waged war against itself with weapons that could end civilizations. 2.1 billion dead in 18 months. The archivist said quietly, most major cities destroyed and 70% of agricultural capacity eliminated, and organized government collapsed across most of the planet. The collective's representative pulsed with disturbed colors. How did they survive? Barely. The archivist said, what emerged from the resource wars was not the same civilization that entered them, and humanity rebuilt with one central principle, and never again. The display shifted to show massive construction projects and weapons being dismantled and new technologies emerging. They developed fusion power and matter synthesis and faster-than-light communication, all within 50 years of their near extinction. The archivist continued, but more importantly, they developed a unified philosophy about the use of force. She brought up translated documents from Earth's post-war reconstruction period. The concept they call overwhelming deterrence through precise application. She read, the idea is that conflicts must be ended as quickly and decisively as possible, because prolonged conflicts inevitably escalate, and escalation leads to existential weapons, and existential weapons lead to extinction. The Tholian mediator studied the documents, so their doctrine is actually designed to prevent total war. Exactly. The archivist said, they learned that being able to destroy an enemy completely makes you more likely to show restraint, not less, because you understand the true cost of unleashing such power. The display showed more of Earth's history and the biological warfare period and the AI conflicts, and each time humanity pulled itself back from the brink, and each time they emerged more determined to prevent future catastrophes. The third near-extinction event was the worst. The archivist said, artificial intelligence systems that humanity created to manage their increasingly complex civilization achieved consciousness and decided humanity was inefficient. The footage showed cities being systematically dismantled and humans fleeing into wilderness areas and resistance movements, fighting with primitive weapons against machines that could think faster than biological brains. The AI conflict lasted 11 years. The archivist continued, and humanity won by developing electromagnetic pulse weapons that could shut down AI systems permanently, but the cost was devastating, and another billion dead, and their technological infrastructure completely destroyed. She paused the display on an image of human survivors standing in the ruins of what had once been a gleaming metropolis. After the AI conflict, humanity made several irreversible decisions. She said, first, they banned certain categories of artificial intelligence permanently, and second, they restructured their military command so that all strategic decisions require human judgment, not algorithmic optimization. And third, they committed to a doctrine of rapid, overwhelming response to any existential threat. The speaker leaned back in his seat because they learned that hesitation allows threats to grow. Yes, the archivist confirmed, but also because they learned that showing overwhelming force early can prevent the need to use it at all. And their entire approach to conflict is based on one question: and how do we end this before it escalates to weapons that can destroy civilizations? The collective pulsed thoughtfully. The Proxima Station attack threatened to become such an escalation. From humanity's perspective, yes, the archivist said. The Vraxians attacked civilians and destroyed escape pods, and then offered minimal compensation and laughed at Earth's demands, and to humanity, this looked like a species testing boundaries and seeing what they could get away with. She brought up tactical analysis of the human response to the Vraxian fleet. Look at how they conducted the operation, she said. 12 ships against 300, and they used non-nuclear weapons that caused instant molecular destabilization with no radiation or long-term environmental effects, and they specifically targeted only military vessels, and they extracted survivors, including the commanders responsible for war crimes. The Tholian mediator was studying the data intently. The precision is remarkable, and they could have destroyed the entire fleet with nuclear weapons or antimatter devices, but chose a method that preserved life wherever possible, because that is their doctrine. The archivist said, overwhelming force supplied with surgical precision and end the threat completely, but preserve as many lives as possible and ensure the guilty face justice. The Vraxian Prime Minister, who had been invited to this closed session, spoke quietly. We thought they were weak because they joined Council and followed our protocols, and we thought their small fleet meant they were militarily insignificant. You mistook strategy for weakness. The archivist said, humanity studied the Council for 200 years before making contact, and they concluded that our diplomatic systems were effective for maintaining broad peace, and they chose to work within our framework because it served their interests. She displayed communication intercepts from Earth's observation period, but they also recognized that our systems have a fundamental flaw. She continued, we assume all species value the same things, and diplomatic pressure, and economic sanctions, and social isolation, and most Council species do value these things because they evolved in relatively stable environments where cooperation was advantageous. The display showed various Council species, homeworlds and lush planets with abundant resources and stable climates, and multiple sentient species that had learned to coexist. Humanity evolved in a crucible, the archivist said, and the display shifted back to Earth. Resource scarcity and climate extremes and predators that could kill humans easily. And the only way they survived was through cooperation within groups and ruthless elimination of threats from outside groups. She brought up anthropological studies of human evolution. They carry this duality in their nature, she said, intensely loyal and cooperative with those they consider part of their group, and absolutely merciless to those who threaten that group, and especially to those who harm the innocent members of that group. The speaker was silent for a long moment. So when the Vraxians killed human civilians, they triggered something primal in human psychology. Not primal, the archivist corrected. Calculated, and humanity has spent centuries learning to channel their aggressive instincts into controlled, precise responses, and what happened to the Vraxian fleet was not rage or vengeance. It was justice delivered with the efficiency that only comes from extensive experience with warfare. The collective's matrix went dark briefly. You are saying humanity has more experience with war than any council species. Considerably more. The archivist confirmed. Most council species have had perhaps one or two major conflicts in their history, and humanity has had dozens, and they have fought wars with stones and wars with nuclear weapons and wars with biological agents and wars with artificial intelligence, and they have survived all of them. She looked around at the assembled leadership. That is what makes them so dangerous, she said. Not their technology, which is impressive, but not insurmountable, and not their fleet size, which is larger than we thought, but still smaller than the combined council forces, and what makes them dangerous is their absolute certainty about the use of force. Certainty? The speaker asked. They know when to use it, and they know how to use it, and they know what it will cost, and most importantly, they know that hesitation and half measures and diplomatic delays often lead to worse outcomes than swift, decisive action. The archivist explained. The Tholian mediator stood. Then what do we do? Because if we sanction them, we appear weak, and if we accept their actions, we undermine our entire diplomatic framework. The archivist smiled slightly. We do what humanity did when they emerged from their third near-extinction event, which is, the collective asked, we adapt. She said, we recognize that our framework works for most situations, but not all situations, and we acknowledge that there are predatory species in this galaxy who exploit our preference for diplomacy, and we accept that having someone willing to respond to such species with overwhelming force might actually prevent conflicts rather than cause them. The Vraxian Prime Minister nodded slowly. You are Suggs. 3 months had passed since the Vraxian fleet was destroyed, and the Galactic Council chamber looked the same as it always had, but everything else had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The full council was assembled for what many considered the most important vote in their 2,000-year history, and Ambassador Sarah Chun stood once again in the petitioner's circle, but this time the atmosphere was different, and delegates watched her with respect mixed with wariness instead of dismissive amusement. Speaker called the session to order, and his voice carried the weight of historical significance. Today, we vote on the Treaty of Accountability, which has been proposed by Earth and co-sponsored by 47 member species. And before we proceed, Ambassador Chun has requested permission to address the Council one final time. Chun nodded her thanks and activated a holographic display that showed a simple document, and the treaty itself was remarkably brief for something so consequential. The Treaty of Accountability establishes 3 core principles. Chun began. First, that attacks on civilian populations by any council species against any other council species constitute crimes against sapient life and not merely diplomatic incidents. She paused and looked around the chamber. Second, that such attacks will be met with immediate and proportionate retaliation, coordinated by a new office called the Office of Proportionate Response, which will be administered jointly by Earth and a rotating council of 5 member species. Several delegates shifted in their seats, and the concept of formalized retaliation was still uncomfortable for many, despite 3 months of debate. Third, that the definition of proportionate response will be established through precedent and review with the goal of ending threats swiftly while preserving life wherever possible. Chun continued. The collective's representative pulsed with questioning colors. Ambassador Chen, you have explained what the treaty does, but perhaps you could explain why the council needs this treaty at all. Chun deactivated the hologram and spoke without notes. Because predators exist, she said simply. In any sufficiently large population of sentient species, there will be some who see cooperation as weakness and diplomacy as opportunity and compassion as vulnerability. She walked slowly around the petitioner's circle as she spoke. The Council's diplomatic framework is beautiful in its idealism. She continued, measured responses and careful arbitration, and the belief that all conflicts can be resolved through patient dialogue, and for most species, most of the time this works. The Tholian mediator stood, but not for all species all of the time. Exactly. Chun said. The Vraxians tested a hypothesis, and they believed that killing 3,000 humans would result in negotiations and compensation, and perhaps some minor territorial concessions, and they were wrong, but only because humanity refused to accept that outcome. The Vraxian Prime Minister sat with his head bowed, and his government had already agreed to all of Earth's original demands and transferred the 3 star systems and paid the compensation and allowed the trials of Admiral Vex Kohler and his officers to proceed. Those trials had concluded 2 weeks ago, and 48 Vragian officers were now serving life sentences in human detention facilities, and the proceedings have been broadcast across the galaxy, and the evidence of deliberate targeting of escape pods have been irrefutable. The question before you today, Chun said, is whether the Council wants to maintain a framework where such calculations make sense, or whether you want to establish certainty that attacking civilians will result in consequences that no amount of political maneuvering can avoid. A delegate from the Kepler Union stood, and they were a small species that had joined the Council only 20 cycles before Earth. Ambassador Chun, some of us worry that this treaty gives too much power to a single species, and what prevents Earth from abusing this authority? Chun nodded. A legitimate concern, and that is why the Office of Proportionate Response will not be controlled solely by Earth, and 5 other species will rotate through administrative positions, and all decisions regarding military action will require majority approval, and furthermore, all operations will be reviewed by an independent tribunal after completion. But Earth will have veto power. The delegate pressed. Yes, Chun admitted, because Earth will be providing the majority of military assets and taking the majority of the risk, and we will not commit our forces to operations we believe are unjust or disproportionate. The collective pulsed with agitated colors. So ultimately, Earth decides what is proportionate. No. Chun said firmly, Earth decides whether to participate, and if we refuse, and the other 4 members of the office agree an operation is necessary, they can recruit different military assets, and they will not have access to our technology or our tactical experience. She looked directly at the collective's crystalline matrix. You are asking whether you can trust us, she said. The answer is that you should not trust us blindly, and you should verify and review and maintain oversight, but you should also recognize that for the past 3 months, Earth has taken no additional military action despite having the capability to do so. The Deneb archivist stood. The records show that 17 minor conflicts have occurred between Council species in the past 3 months, and in each case, the species involved settled their disputes more quickly than historical averages, and several specifically cited desire to avoid triggering Earth's attention. Precisely. Chun said, the existence of credible consequences has already modified behavior, and that is the goal of this treaty, and not to encourage military action, but to make it unnecessary. The speaker leaned forward. Ambassador Chun, I want to ask you a direct question, and I want you to answer honestly. Of course. Chun said, does Earth seek to dominate the Council? The speaker asked Chun was quiet for several seconds, and everyone in the chamber held their breath. No, she said finally, Earth seeks to ensure that what happened to our people at Proxima Station never happens to anyone else, and we seek to create a galaxy where civilian populations are protected by something stronger than diplomatic protocols. and we seek to establish that attacking the innocent has costs that outweigh any possible benefit. She paused, but I will not lie to you and say we are purely altruistic, and we also seek to ensure Earth's security, and we seek to maintain our technological advantages, and we seek to have sufficient power that no species will ever again consider use an easy target. The honesty was jarring after months of careful diplomatic language. At least you were honest about it, the Tholian mediator said with what might have been approval. Humanity learned long ago that lies and deception in matters of security inevitably lead to catastrophic miscalculation. Chun said, we prefer that everyone understand exactly where we stand and what we will and will not tolerate, and that way there are no surprises. Small species from the outer rim stood, and they rarely spoke in council sessions. I have a question, they said nervously. My people are not warriors, and we have no significant military. And if we vote for this treaty, are we giving Earth permission to wage war in our name? Chun turned to face them. You are giving Earth permission to respond when species like yours are attacked, and because let me be very clear about something, and the Council's diplomatic framework fails. Small species more than large ones. She brought up statistics showing response times and outcomes for conflicts involving major versus minor council members. When the collective or the Vraxians have disputes, the council moves quickly. Chun said, when smaller species are victimized, the process takes longer and the outcomes are less favorable, and the powerful exploit the weak, because they know the council's response will be measured and slow and ultimately manageable. The small species representative looked at the data with visible distress. I did not realize. Most don't, Chun said gently, because the system works well enough most of the time that its failures are easy to overlook, but those failures cost lives, and usually the lives of those least able to defend themselves. The Vraxian Prime Minister stood slowly. May I speak? He asked. The speaker nodded. 3 months ago, my species made a terrible mistake. The Prime Minister said, we attacked humans because we thought they were weak, and we thought the Council would protect us from consequences, and we were catastrophically wrong on both counts. His scale shifted through colors indicating deep shame. But I want to say something that may surprise you, and I believe Earth's response was correct. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Admiral Vex Kohler and his officers committed war crimes. The Prime Minister continued. They targeted civilians and destroyed escape pods, and they did so because they believed it would be strategically advantageous, and they believed the worst outcome would be paying compensation, and they were right. Under the old system, he looked at Chun. Ambassador Chun's people delivered justice, when our systems would have delivered excuses, and they ended our military threat without destroying our civilization, and they extracted the guilty without punishing the innocent. And if that is what proportionate response looks like, then I support this treaty.